He paid a stranger's debt in a snowstorm of blood money and walked away without a name. 10 years later, that debt would walk into his ER covered in someone else's blood and refuse to let him die. Some men buy silence. Daejin Kim bought a second chance and never once asked for it back. Seoul doesn't remember Daejin Kim for mercy. It remembers him for the ledger he kept in blood, the empire he ran with a closed fist, and the one night, 10 years ago, when that fist opened for a dying girl he owed nothing. Now that girl is Dr. Lola, sharp, fearless, running on 3 hours of sleep in a hospital that's about to become a battlefield. The ER doors blow open. A man is rushed and broken, betrayed, one breath from flatlining. Lola wipes the blood from his face to call it, and stops. She knows this face. She spent 10 years wondering if she'd ever see it again. She just didn't expect to be the one holding it together. If a hook like this has you leaning in already, subscribe now. Chapter 1 drops next, where a bloodied gurney and a girl who owes him her life change everything. And comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and know just how far our story is traveling. The ambulance bay doors blew open before the tires had fully stopped rolling, and the night tore itself in half. Multiple GSW, male, 60s, unresponsive on arrival, BP crashing, the paramedic shouted, already running, already pumping the bag valve mask like a man trying to squeeze life back into a body that had decided to let it go. Blood soaked through the gurney sheet in a slow, spreading continent, dripping in fat red beads onto the tile. Seoul Metro Hospital's ER didn't do quiet nights, but this one was different. This one smelled like cordite instead of just fear. Word had already crackled through the scanner traffic, a shootout downtown, a convoy shredded, bodies left in the street like a warning. Whatever gang war had detonated somewhere in the dark, its wreckage was now flooding through these doors in waves, and the trauma bay was a chessboard of screaming and machines and hands moving too fast to think. Dr. Lola didn't look up from the chest compressions she was mid-cycle on for a stab wound victim in Bay 2, even as her senior resident, Min Jun, sprinted past her hollering triage orders like a man drowning. "We've got another incoming," VIP flagged. "Looks bad. Real bad. Everyone's VIP tonight," she muttered, counting compressions under her breath, sweat sticking her scrub top to her spine. She'd been on shift for 14 hours. Her feet had stopped complaining somewhere around hour 10, gone numb in that way that told her she'd pay for it tomorrow. Lola had learned a long time ago that the body negotiates with you when you push it. It stops arguing and just goes quiet, waiting for the bill. The stab wound patient stabilized enough to hand off. She barely had time to strip her gloves before Min Jun was back at her elbow, eyes wide in a way she didn't like. Min Jun didn't rattle easy. He'd seen decapitations, seen a man's femur poking clean out of his thigh, seen a kid pulled from a car fire with skin like melted wax, and none of it had ever put that particular look on his face. "Bay 4, he said. "You need to see this one yourself." She didn't ask why. There wasn't time to ask why. She just moved. The new arrival hit the trauma bay like a wrecking ball of noise. Nurses shouting vitals, the anesthesiologist barking for a second IV line, the overhead monitor screaming its alarm as a heart rate ping-ponged between too fast and too faint. The man on the gurney was older, maybe 60, with a mane of gray hair matted dark with blood at the temple. His once immaculate suit now a ruined, soaked wreck, clinging to a body that had clearly been on the losing end of something violent. Multiple entry wounds, a laceration across the scalp deep enough to show bone. His skin had gone the color of wet ash. "Talk to me," Lola snapped, already snapping on fresh gloves, sliding into the space at the head of the gurney like she'd been poured there. GSW to the abdomen, ×2. Entry and no exit on the left flank. Possible retained round, the trauma nurse fired back. Blunt force trauma to the skull, pupils sluggish. BP's tanking, 70 over palp and dropping, he's crashing. Get me 2 units O-neg, wide open, and somebody page anesthesia for airway now. The man's hand shot up off the gurney and closed around her wrist. It happened so fast it startled the whole room into a half-second of silence. This half-dead man with a punctured gut and a fractured skull, finding, from somewhere, the strength to grab her. His grip was like iron. His eyes, glassy, unfocused, drenched in pain, tried to find her face and couldn't quite land. "Sir, I need you to let go. I need to work." He didn't let go. His lips moved, cracked and bloody, forming something that might have been a word, might have been nothing at all, just a reflexive twitch of a dying man's mouth. And then his grip slackened, his hand fell away, and his eyes rolled back, and the monitor's scream climbed another octave. "He's coding, starting compressions." Lola threw herself into it, hands laced, weight driving down through her shoulders, counting under her breath the way she'd counted 10,000 times before, the way that had become as natural to her as breathing. Around her, the room detonated into the practiced chaos of a code, someone calling out epidoses, someone else charging the defibrillator just in case, the rhythmic hiss of the ambu bag, the clatter of a crash cart wheeled in too fast and nearly tipping. She didn't have time to look at his face, not yet. There wasn't a version of this job that let you look at faces while a chest was open under your palms and a heart was arguing with death. There was only the next compression, and the one after that, and the next order barked into the noise, and the desperate focused tunnel of now, which was the only place Lola had ever felt truly, completely herself. But some part of her, some old, quiet, buried part that never fully went to sleep even in the worst of the noise, had heard that half-formed word from his cracked lips, and it had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs like a splinter she hadn't yet noticed was there. 10 years earlier, Seoul had been colder. Or maybe it had only felt that way because Lola had been smaller then, and small bodies feel the cold more honestly, without the armor adults build for themselves out of habit and denial. She remembered the alley behind the noodle shop, mostly, because that was where she'd collapsed. Her mother had been carrying her, 9 years old and weighing what a 6-year-old should, through streets that didn't care whose child was dying in them, looking for anyone, any hospital, any doctor who would look twice at a foreign woman with no money, and a daughter whose heart was failing in her chest, like a machine grinding its last gears. Congenital defect. That was the phrase the free clinic doctor had used, months earlier, with the practiced gentleness of a man who had delivered that particular kind of bad news 100 times before, and had learned exactly how much softness to wrap it in, so it didn't shatter the person receiving it. Ventricular septal defect. Uncorrected, worsening. Surgery, if it happens at all, needs to happen soon. And then, quieter, because he knew what he was really saying, the number. A number so large it may as well have been a joke. A number that turned, if it happens at all, into the only part of the sentence that mattered. Her mother had said thank you, and had not cried until they were outside. That night in the alley, her mother's arms shaking with the effort of holding her up, a car had rolled to a stop at the mouth of the street. Black, low, expensive in the specific way that expensive things are when they don't need to announce themselves. 2 men got out first, scanning the alley like they were checking a room for exits before deciding whether to enter it. Then a 3rd man stepped out, unhurried, adjusting the cuff of a dark suit jacket like the blood on the pavement nearby. From some transaction Lola would never learn the details of, some piece of the city's underside that had bled onto this street just before they arrived, was simply weather he was choosing to ignore. Daejin Kim did not, as a rule, notice desperate women in alleys. Desperate women in alleys were the background noise of the world he moved through, the wallpaper behind every deal, every debt collection, every quiet threat delivered over tea. He had built an empire on the specific talent of not noticing things that weren't useful to him. It was, in its way, the only kind of mercy his line of work allowed. The mercy of a clean, uncomplicated indifference. But the girl in her mother's arms had her eyes open. Barely, flickering, unfocused, the whites gone faintly yellow with the strain her heart was putting on the rest of her, but open, and fixed, for one unbearable second, directly on him. He would spend the next 10 years trying, and failing, to explain to himself why that mattered. He crossed the alley, his men tensed, hands twitching toward jackets, uncertain what their boss was doing, wandering toward a collapsing stranger, instead of getting back in the car where it was safe, where the night's other, uglier business could be finished and forgotten. Daejin ignored them. He crouched, which was a thing men in his position did not do, did not kneel, did not lower themselves, not for anyone, and he looked at the girl's face, gray under the streetlight, and then at the mother, who had gone completely rigid with terror at the realization of exactly whose attention her daughter had accidentally captured. "Please," the mother said in broken Korean. "Please, I don't want trouble, we're leaving." What's wrong with her? It wasn't a question so much as an extraction. Daejin didn't ask things he wanted to know. He simply took the information, the way he took everything else. The mother, shaking, told him. The heart, the surgery, the number that might as well have been the moon. Daejin was quiet for a long moment. One of his men, Sang-hoon, would tell people years later, quietly, disbelievingly, the way you tell people about a UFO sighting, that in that silence, something moved behind the boss's eyes that he had never seen there before and never saw there again. Not softness exactly, more like a door, briefly ajar, revealing a room nobody knew the house had. "Take her to Seoul National," Daejin said finally, standing, straightening his cuff again as if the moment required tidiness. "Cardiac wing. Ask for Dr. Han. Tell him Daejin Kim is covering it. All of it." The mother stared at him like he'd spoken in a language made of static. "Why? Why would you?" "Don't," Daejin said, and there was an edge back in his voice now, the familiar one, the one that had ended arguments and occasionally ended lives. "Don't ask me that. Take her before I decide I misspoke." He was already turning back toward the car. The mother caught his sleeve, a boldness that made both of his men go still with alarm. Because people who touched Daejin Kim without permission did not, generally, keep the privilege of touching anything ever again. "Her name is Lola," the mother said, as if it were the only currency she had left to offer him, the only thing of value in her possession. "Please, just so you know, her name is Lola." Daejin looked at the girl one more time. Her eyes had drifted shut again, her breathing shallow and rattling, but her chest, he noted with something that felt disturbingly like relief, was still rising and falling. "I don't need to know her name," he said, and got in the car. He never went to check on her, never asked Dr. Han how the surgery went, never followed up, never sent a man to confirm the money had done what money was supposed to do. He told himself it was because a man in his position couldn't afford loose threads, couldn't have people knowing he had a soft spot they could pull on. That was the story he told himself for years. The tidy, defensible version. The truer version, the one he never said aloud to anyone, not even after everything that came later, was that he was afraid. Afraid that if he went to see whether she'd lived, and found out she hadn't, something in him would break that he had spent 30 years building into unbreakable shape. It was easier, safer, to simply not know, to let the moment stay sealed in the alley where it happened, uncorrupted by an ending. He never learned her name had lodged itself in him anyway, whether he wanted it to or not. Lola. A small foreign word rattling around in the architecture of a man built entirely out of Korean stone. By the time the sun rose, the mother and the recovering girl had vanished from the city entirely, relocating somewhere far from the alley, far from the noodle shop, far from any life that might put them back in the path of the man who'd bought them a future neither of them fully understood the price of. Daejin never looked for them. It was the only mercy he knew how to give twice, leaving well enough alone. Back in the trauma bay, the monitor's alarm cut off. Sinus rhythm, thready but present, dragging itself back up out of the flatline, like a swimmer breaking the surface after too long under. "We've got a pulse. BP's coming up, 60/40 and climbing." "Don't celebrate yet," Lola said, already moving, hands steady even as her mind raced 3 steps ahead. "He needs the OR. Now. That abdomen isn't going to hold. Somebody get me a clean towel. I need to see what we're actually dealing with under all this blood, before I sign off on anything." A nurse pressed a damp cloth into her hand. Lola leaned over the patient's ruined face, swollen at the temple, one eye already purpling, blood dried into the deep creases the years had carved there, and began, with the brisk clinical efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more, wiping the grime and gore away so she could actually assess what she was looking at. Gray hair, thick and wavy, even matted with blood. A weathered face, older than she'd first clocked in the noise of the code. Lines around the eyes and mouth that spoke of decades of something. Command, maybe. Or the particular exhaustion of never once being allowed to look afraid. She wiped the cloth across his cheekbone, his jaw. Her hand stopped. The room kept moving around her. Min Jun calling for the OR to be prepped, someone reading off a fresh set of vitals. But for Lola, for one long suspended second, the noise fell away entirely, the way it does in the instant before a car crash, when the world goes strangely, terribly quiet. She knew this face. She had built an entire childhood memory around this face, half from what she'd actually seen through 9-year-old eyes gone dim with fever, and half from what her mother had described to her 100 times over the years, in the hushed, reverent tone people use for miracles. A man in a dark suit, crouching in an alley that smelled like garbage and diesel, who had looked at a dying stranger's child and, for reasons neither of them had ever understood, decided to spend a fortune making sure she lived. Her mother had never learned his name, he hadn't given it, hadn't wanted it known, but there had been a driver, later, at the hospital, filling out paperwork with a company name Lola's mother had memorized like scripture, and years afterward, grown and armed with the internet and an unbearable curiosity, Lola had gone looking. She'd found a photograph, eventually, grainy, taken at a distance. A man getting into a black car outside a restaurant. His face turned just enough toward the camera to be recognizable. A name attached to a rumor, attached to a warning. Don't go looking for this man, whoever you are. Whatever you think you owe him, it isn't worth the finding out. She had looked anyway, once, quietly, alone in her dorm room at 2 a.m. during her second year of medical school, and had closed the laptop afterward feeling like she'd trespassed somewhere she had no right to be. She had never looked again, and now that same face, older, ruined, bleeding out on her gurney, was under her hand. Lola. Min Jun's voice, cutting through. Lola. We need to move him. OR6 is prepped. What's the holdup? I've got this one, Lola said. Her voice came out strange to her own ears. Too flat, too controlled. The voice of someone holding something enormous perfectly still. I'm taking him up myself. Min Jun blinked. You're not on the surgical rotation tonight. You're ER attending. Dr. Choi's supposed to. I'm taking him, Lola said again, and something in her tone made Min Jun stop arguing, made the whole room's rhythm shift half a beat around the decision she'd just made without room for negotiation. It was, of course, the chief of surgery who found the negotiation anyway, 10 minutes later, catching Lola at the scrub sink with the particular fury of a man whose hierarchy had just been quietly stepped over. Dr. Lola. Dr. Choi's voice was clipped, controlled in the way that meant he was working hard not to raise it in front of the staff. I was told you pulled the VIP trauma case off my board without authorization. He's stable enough for transport, unstable for delay, Lola said, scrubbing methodically, not looking up. I made the call at the bedside. There wasn't time to loop through committee. There's always time to follow protocol, doctor. That's the entire point of protocol. With respect, sir, protocol didn't just have its hands on a patient's open abdomen 10 minutes ago. I did. She finally looked at him, and something in her expression, a steadiness, a refusal, something that had not been there in her the last time Choi had tried to overrule her about anything, made him pause. I've got the OR prepped, I've got the patient's full history from the scan, and I am not walking away from this table tonight. If you want to write me up for it, write me up after he's off the ventilator and stable. I'll sign whatever you want then. Choi studied her for a long moment. He was not by nature a man who backed down easily, and in 5 years of watching him run the surgical wing, Lola had never once seen him simply let a challenge to his authority go unanswered. But there was something in her face just then, a fierceness that went past professional stubbornness into something closer to a woman guarding a door with her body, that made even Choi hesitate to push further in that particular moment, in front of that particular staff. You'd better be right about him being stable enough to move, he said finally, low, a warning disguised as a concession. I am, Lola said, and turned back to the sink, and did not let him see her hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just once, before she steadied them and pulled on her gloves. Across the city, in a penthouse office 30 floors above a street that had, hours earlier, been briefly and violently rearranged by gunfire, a younger man in an expensive suit set down a phone with the exaggerated, deliberate calm of someone who wanted very badly to throw it through a window instead. Confirmed? He asked the room, though the room already knew the answer, because the room had been the one to bring him the news and was now regretting it. Confirmed, said the man standing across the desk, broad-shouldered, scarred at the jaw, a lieutenant of the old guard who had served Daejin Kim for 11 years and was now, tonight, discovering exactly how quickly loyalty could be reorganized when the person signing the checks changed. The convoy was hit like we planned. 4 dead, 2 of ours took injuries covering the extraction, but But he's alive, the younger man finished, flatly. He's alive, taken to Seoul Metro. Critical, but alive. Jae-won, Daejin's only son, 34 years old, raised in the periphery of an empire he'd spent his whole life circling like a shark that had never quite been allowed to feed, walked to the window and looked out over the skyline his father had spent 3 decades quietly buying, piece by piece, deal by bloody deal. He had grown up hearing his father's name spoken in rooms full of grown men gone suddenly, carefully silent. He had grown up understanding, long before he understood much else, that respect and fear were the same currency, wearing different faces, and that his father had more of both than anyone else in the city. And he had grown up watching over the last decade as that same father grew soft. Not obviously, Daejin Kim did not do obvious, but in the small accumulating ways that a son who was paying attention could not help but notice. Deals his father used to close in a single ruthless afternoon, now dragging on for weeks, softened by concessions that made no operational sense. Money moving out of the syndicate's accounts through channels Jae-won couldn't fully trace, quietly, consistently, for years, like a slow leak in a pipe his father refused to acknowledge or repair. It had taken Jae-won the better part of 2 years, and a forensic accountant he'd had to pay a small fortune to keep quiet, to finally trace where that leak was actually going. A private account, a university tuition, then a medical school tuition, then a residency stipend, then a research grant, all funneled anonymously through 3 shell layers to a young woman named Lola, no surname attached anywhere in the paperwork that mattered, scrubbed clean the way only someone deeply careful, or deeply guilty, scrubs a paper trail. Jae-won still didn't know who she was to his father, a mistress's daughter maybe, an old debt from before Jae-won was born. He genuinely did not care what the sentimental explanation was. What he cared about, what had kept him awake at 3 in the morning for the better part of a year, staring at numbers that didn't belong to him and never would as long as his father kept breathing, was that a man who bled money for a stranger's education was a man who had lost the hardness that had built and protected everything Jae-won stood to inherit. A man like that got them all killed eventually. A man like that already had, tonight, nearly gotten them all killed by rival factions who'd smelled the softness the same way sharks smell blood in the water. He wasn't supposed to survive the convoy, Jae-won said quietly, still facing the window. No, the lieutenant agreed, carefully, watching his new employer with the wariness of a man walking on ice he wasn't sure would hold. Then we finish it at the hospital. Jae-won turned. His face, when it wasn't performing calm for the benefit of the room, had his father's exact same stillness, the stillness of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Quietly, if we can manage it. Loudly, if we can't. I don't particularly care which. A hospital that's an enormous amount of exposure, sir. Security, cameras, civilians. My father built an empire out of doing the thing everyone said was too exposed, Jae-won said. I learned from the best. He walked back to the desk, poured himself a drink he didn't particularly want, just to have something to do with his hands. Send Han So's crew. Tell them I want it finished before sunrise, and I want it to look like exactly what it is. The end of an era nobody has the stomach to mourn. The lieutenant hesitated. 1 beat too long, 1 flicker of something like doubt crossing his scarred face, before he nodded and turned to go. One more thing, Jae-won said, and the lieutenant stopped in the doorway. Find out who this Lola is, the one he's been paying for. I want to know exactly what my father valued enough to bleed the family for, before this is over. He didn't say why he wanted to know. He didn't fully know himself, whether it was curiosity or the desire to understand the shape of his father's one weakness, or some small, buried, unexamined part of him that simply wanted to see, with his own eyes, the thing that had apparently mattered more to Daejin Kim than his own son's inheritance. Whatever the reason, the lieutenant nodded and left to make the calls that would, within the hour, put a small army of armed men on a collision course with a hospital that had no idea what was about to walk through its doors. The surgery, for the first 90 minutes, went as well as anyone had a right to expect given what they were working with. Lola had the abdomen open, the retained round located and extracted with the kind of clean, unhurried precision that made her surgical fellows watch her hands the way music students watch a virtuoso. trying to memorize something that couldn't actually be taught, only absorbed. The bleeding was controlled. The bowel, miraculously, had escaped major perforation. Daejin Kim's vitals, watched by a monitor that had spent the earlier part of the night screaming, had settled into a steady, if fragile, rhythm. Lola worked with her mask on, her eyes the only visible part of her face, and beneath that mask, her thoughts kept circling back, unbidden, to the alley she had never actually seen, to the man her mother had described 1,000 times, to the strange and enormous coincidence of fate that had put this specific body under her specific hands on this specific night, out of every hospital and every surgeon in a city of 10 million people. She did not believe in fate, generally. Medicine had cured her of most of her superstitions the same way it cured most people's, replaced them with statistics, probabilities, the blunt, honest math of biology. But there was no statistic that explained this. There was only the fact of it. The man who had bought her a heart that worked was now lying open on her table, and her hands, the hands his money had trained into precisely this shape of skill, were the only thing standing between him and the same fate he'd once spared her from. "Closing," she murmured to her team, an hour and 40 minutes in, allowing herself the smallest exhale. "Let's get him to recovery, and keep him on close monitoring. I want eyes on him every 15. The lights flickered. It was such a small thing, at first, a half-second stutter in the overhead surgical lamps, gone almost before anyone registered it, that for a moment nobody reacted at all. Then the intercom crackled, and the hospital's automated voice, calm and inhuman in the way emergency systems are built to be calm, cut through the OR. "Code black, code black. All units initiate lockdown protocol. This is not a drill." The room went very still. "What the hell is code black?" one of the younger residents asked, and the tremor in his voice suggested he already suspected, correctly, that the answer was not going to be comforting. "Security threat," Lola said, her voice flat, clinical, the same tone she used to deliver a bad diagnosis, steady on the surface, because steady was the only thing that kept a room from tipping into panic. "Armed intruder protocol." She looked down at the man on her table, unconscious, stitched half-closed, utterly defenseless, and something cold settled into her stomach that had nothing to do with the hospital's climate control. "Somebody get me eyes on that security feed, now." Outside, in the parking structure 3 levels below the surgical wing, a black SUV rolled to a quiet stop, and 6 men in dark tactical gear stepped out with the unhurried, professional calm of people who had done this kind of work before and expected to do it again, moving toward the hospital's east entrance with weapons held low, faces blank, and a single, simple order ringing in their earpieces. "Finish what the convoy started, and don't leave the building until it's done." Lola looked from the frozen security monitor to the pale, unconscious face of the man whose life she had just spent 2 hours dragging back from the edge, and felt the last of the night's earlier chaos rearrange itself into something far more dangerous, far more personal, and far from finished. "Lock the OR," she said. "Nobody in or out until I say so. We are not losing him. Not tonight. Not after everything it took to get him here." Somewhere beneath the practiced calm of a surgeon giving orders, a 9-year-old girl in an alley, 10 years gone, was still holding her mother's hand, still watching a stranger crouch down and decide, against every instinct that had built his entire life, that her survival was worth something. Lola intended to return the favor, whatever it cost her. The intercom's warning was still echoing off the tile when the OR doors banged open and Dr. Choi shoved through them, his surgical mask hanging loose around his neck, his face gone the color of old paper. "Everybody out, now. We're evacuating the surgical floor. He's not stable for transport," Lola said, not looking up from the monitor, where Daejin's blood pressure sat balanced on a knife's edge that only she seemed to fully appreciate the danger of. "Moving him now could kill him. I don't care." Choi's voice cracked on the second word, and Lola understood in that instant that she was not looking at the same controlled, territorial man who'd cornered her at the scrub sink hours earlier. She was looking at a man who had just been told there were armed men in his building, and whose entire understanding of what his job required of him had come apart in the space of 30 seconds. "There are gunmen in this hospital, Lola. Actual armed men, looking for actual blood, and every second we stay in this room is a second we're standing between them and whatever they came here for. I am not losing my staff over one patient. Then take the staff, Lola said. Take everyone who wants to go. I'm not leaving this table. The room had gone very quiet. Min Jun stood near the anesthesia cart, his hand still resting on a dial he'd frozen mid-adjustment. The scrub nurse, a steady, unflappable woman named Grace who had assisted Lola through easily 400 surgeries and had never once, in 3 years, shown Lola anything but calm, was gripping the edge of the instrument tray hard enough that her knuckles had gone bloodless. You understand what you're saying? Choi's voice had dropped, gone low and urgent, the voice of a man trying to reason with someone he was afraid had lost the plot entirely. You understand that whoever's coming through that door isn't coming for a stapler, they're coming for him. He jabbed a finger at the unconscious man on the table. And if you're standing next to him when they find him, they will not politely ask you to step aside. Then they'll have to go through me, Lola said, and something in the flatness of her voice, the total absence of performance in it, made even Choi stop arguing for a beat. Why, he said finally, quieter now, almost pleading, why is this man worth your life? You don't even know him. Nobody in this hospital knows who he actually is, beyond a chart with a fake name on it and a security detail's worth of bullet wounds. Why would you die for a stranger? Lola looked down at Daejin's face, slack now with anesthesia, stripped of whatever fearsome authority it must have carried when he was upright and conscious and running an empire built on the specific talent of making rooms go silent. He looked, in this moment, like nothing more than an old man who had been hurt very badly. She thought of the alley her mother had described to her so many times it had become a kind of scripture in her own memory, even though she'd been too small and too sick to properly remember it herself. A man who owed a dying child nothing, kneeling down anyway. He's not a stranger, she said. That's all I can tell you right now. And I'm not asking anyone else to stay who doesn't want to. I mean that. If you need to get the staff out, get them out. But I'm closing this incision and I'm keeping this man alive, and if that means locking this door and finishing the job myself with whoever's left in this room, that's what I'm going to do. The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific heaviness of a room deciding, all at once and without discussion, which side of a line it was going to stand on. I'm staying, Min Jun said. He said it fast, like he was afraid that if he thought about it any longer he'd talk himself out of it, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. But he said it, and he didn't look away from Lola when he did. Grace? Lola asked. Grace's hands, gripping the tray, finally steadied. Somebody has to hand you your instruments, she said. Might as well be me. Choi looked between the three of them, his residents, his staff, choosing a stranger on a table over the safety their training had never actually prepared them to weigh against a life. And something in his face shifted from panic into a harder, more complicated thing. You're all out of your minds, he said, but he was already moving toward the door. Not to leave, Lola realized, but to lock it, throwing the manual bolt that the OR kept for exactly the kind of contamination protocols nobody ever expected to use for an actual siege. I'm getting the rest of the floor evacuated. Whoever wants out, goes now, through the west stairwell, and whoever's staying, he looked back at Lola, and for the first time all night, there was something almost like respect buried under the fear in his expression. God help you. I'll have security do what they can to slow this down. It won't be much. He was gone before Lola could answer, his footsteps receding fast down the corridor, already shouting orders to the nurses' station, already becoming, in the space of a few seconds, the version of himself that the crisis actually required. Lola looked at the door he'd locked behind him, then at Min Jun, then at Grace. Okay, she said, and picked her instrument back up, her hand rock steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough that she was faintly amazed the surgical monitors weren't picking it up as a second patient. Let's finish this. 3 floors down, in a stairwell that smelled of antiseptic and old paint, 4 men in dark tactical gear moved with the unhurried precision of people being paid extremely well to not be seen. Security had, as promised, done what it could. A guard posted at the east entrance had gotten off 2 shots and a radio call before he went down, and the hospital's skeleton overnight security team was now scrambling to seal what doors could still be sealed, herding non-critical patients and visitors toward exits, buying time they didn't have much of to buy. The lead gunman, a wiry man named Han So who had done exactly this kind of work in exactly this kind of building on 3 prior occasions, held up a fist at the stairwell door marked 4, surgical. His men stopped behind him without a sound. "Command reports the target still in the OR," a voice murmured through his earpiece. "Floor's going into lockdown. You'll have maybe 10 minutes before internal security manages to alert an outside response, if they manage it at all." 10 minutes is plenty, Hanso murmured back, and eased the stairwell door open onto a corridor gone eerily still, emergency lighting washing the walls a low, bloodless red. Above them, on the surgical floor itself, chaos of a different kind had already begun. "We need to block every access point to the OR wing," Lola's charge nurse, a broad no-nonsense woman named Yoon-hee, was shouting to what remained of the surgical floor's staff, a skeleton crew of 6 who had chosen, for reasons of loyalty or stubbornness or simple shock, not to run when the evacuation order came. "Everything that isn't bolted to the floor I wanted in front of that door." It was, Yoon-hee would say later, one of the strangest sights of her career, a hospital's surgical wing, in the space of 6 frantic minutes, transformed into something out of a siege film. An MRI-adjacent supply cart, heavy with lead-lined equipment, wheeled shrieking across the tile and rammed against the double doors leading into the OR corridor. A crash cart, then a second one, stacked against it. A gurney flipped on its side. A rolling X-ray unit, easily 400 pounds, muscled into place by 2 orderlies who would both later swear they had no idea where the adrenaline to move something that heavy had come from. "It won't hold forever," one of the orderlies said, breathless, surveying the makeshift wall they'd built. "It doesn't need to hold forever," Yoon-hee said. "It needs to hold long enough." Inside the OR itself, Lola worked with a focus so total it had narrowed the entire world down to the width of an incision. Daejin's abdomen was closing beautifully, the internal repairs solid, the bleeding controlled, everything textbook right up until the moment it wasn't. The monitor's steady beeping developed a stutter. "BP's dropping," Minjun said, his eyes fixed on the readout, his voice climbing half an octave with barely restrained alarm. 90 over 60, 80 over 50. "Lola, something's wrong. This isn't post-surgical drift. This is... I see it." Lola's hands didn't stop moving, but her mind had already leapt 3 steps ahead, running through differentials with the cold, fast clarity that crisis always seemed to sharpen in her rather than dull. Internal bleed she'd missed, a reaction to the anesthesia. Cardiac strain from the trauma, finally catching up with a heart that had been asked to do too much, too fast, for a body that had spent the last several hours being shot, beaten, and cut open. "Grace, get the crash cart positioned. Now." The monitor's tone changed from stutter to shriek. Flatline. For one suspended, terrible second, the OR went completely silent except for that single unbroken tone, the sound that every person in medicine learns to fear more than almost any other, because it is the sound of the exact thing they have all dedicated their lives to preventing. "Starting compressions," Lola said, and her voice, impossibly, did not shake, even as something in her chest twisted itself into a shape she didn't have time to examine. She drove the heel of her hand down onto Daejin Kim's sternum, the same chest that 10 years ago and 100 miles away in memory had belonged to a man crouching in an alley, deciding a stranger's life mattered more than his own reputation for ruthlessness, and began to count. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Minjun, epi, 0.1 milligrams, now. Somewhere below them, muffled through 3 floors of concrete and steel, came a sound that under any other circumstances might have been mistaken for a car backfiring. It wasn't. Everyone in that OR knew exactly what it was. Gunfire, distant but unmistakable, the first exchange between hospital security and the men climbing steadily, patiently, toward the surgical floor. "They're in the building," Grace said, very quietly, handing Lola the epinephrine syringe with hands that had, for the first time all night, begun to tremble. "I know," Lola said. "Compressions. Keep counting with me." The gunfire grew closer, not constant but punctuated, the sound of men moving floor by floor, meeting resistance, overcoming it, moving on. Somewhere on the 3rd floor a scream cut off abruptly. Somewhere closer, glass shattered. "Charging the paddles," Minjun said, his voice tight, sweat sliding down his temple despite the OR's carefully regulated cold. 200 joules. "Clear," Lola said, and the current arced through Daejin's chest, his whole body jolting against the table in that violent, undignified way that always looked, on television, far more dramatic and far less desperate than it actually was. The monitor held its flat line. Again, compressions. Lola was back on his chest immediately, counting, sweat now running freely down her own face. Her arms burning with an ache she would not let herself acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting how close to the edge of her own endurance she actually was. Somewhere in the rhythm of the compressions, in the counting, in the narrow tunnel of now that crisis always built around her, a memory surfaced unbidden, her mother's voice, years ago, describing the alley, describing a stranger's hands, and Lola thought, with a clarity that felt almost like anger, "You don't get to die on me. Not after everything it cost to keep you alive long enough to be here." Outside the OR doors, the barricade shuddered. "They're at the doors," Yoon-hee's voice came through, muffled, tight with fear but still, impossibly, steady. "The MRI cart's holding but they're pushing. A gunshot, close now, terribly close, the sound of a lock being obliterated rather than picked. Charging again," Min-jun said. 250. Clear. The current arced. Daejin's body jolted, the monitor blipped, faltered, held. Then, agonizingly slow, a rhythm, thready, weak, but there, dragging itself back up out of the flat silent line like something climbing hand over hand out of a well. "We've got him," Min-jun said, his voice cracking with something between relief and disbelief. Sinus rhythm, weak but, "Lola, he's back." The OR doors shuddered again, harder this time, the sound of the barricade beginning, finally, to give. "Not yet," Lola said, already moving, checking his pressure, checking the incision for any sign the resuscitation had reopened what she'd just spent 2 hours closing. "We are not out of this yet, Min-jun. I need pressors running, now." And somebody, the doors shuddered a third time, a splintering crack audible now beneath the metal groan of the cart being shoved slowly, inexorably across the tile. "Somebody give me something I can use to buy us 30 more seconds." There was nothing in the room built for that purpose. There was a scalpel tray, a defibrillator, an unconscious man who had just been dragged back from death by the width of a single shock, and 3 people who had chosen, hours ago, not to run. The doors gave. Hanso stepped through the wreckage of the barricade first, weapon raised, his eyes doing the fast professional sweep of a man cataloging threats. The surgeon, the 2 staff, the patient on the table. No visible weapons, minimal resistance expected, and for 1/2 second, in the strange suspended stillness that violence always seems to generate right before it happens, Lola looked directly down the barrel of his rifle and felt, with total clarity, that she was about to die in this room having done exactly what she'd chosen to do, and found that the fear in her, enormous as it was, did not come with any regret attached to it. "Step away from the patient," Hanso said. Lola didn't move. "I said step away." The corridor behind him exploded into gunfire. It came from the far end of the hall, fast and disciplined, and Hanso spun toward it on pure reflex a half second before the first round took him in the shoulder and spun him bodily into the doorframe. Through the ruined barricade, through the chaos suddenly filling the corridor, Lola caught fractured glimpses of men in dark suits. Not tactical gear, suits. The specific expensive tailoring of men who worked for someone who valued appearances even in violence, moving in disciplined pairs, clearing the hallway with the brutal efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of close engagement. "Loyalists," she breathed, not fully understanding how she knew the word was right even as she said it, only that some instinct told her these were not the same men who'd come to finish Daejin Kim. The security system's silent alarm, triggered automatically the moment the OR's manual lockdown engaged, routed through emergency protocols Yoon-hee hadn't even known existed until the notification pinged through to a private security contract buried deep in the hospital's ownership paperwork, had done exactly what it was quietly built to do a decade ago, when a shell corporation with no obvious owner had purchased Seoul Metro Hospital and installed, without any public record of it, protections meant for exactly this scenario, meant for exactly this patient, though no one at the hospital had ever known why. The hallway fight lasted less than 90 seconds and felt, to everyone who lived through it, like considerably longer. When it was over, 4 of Hanso's men were down, 2 more had retreated in a scramble that ended somewhere in a stairwell under a hail of return fire, and the leader of the loyalist team, a broad, scarred man whose face Lola didn't recognize but whose bearing radiated the same absolute, quiet authority she'd glimpsed for half a second in the alley of her memory, stepped through the wreckage of the doorframe and looked past her, straight at the man on the table. "Is he alive?" the man said. It wasn't really a question. "Barely," Lola said. "And he's staying that way if everyone in this doorway stops pointing guns at each other long enough to let me finish my job." The man's eyes moved to her, really looked at her, for the first time, in a way that made her suddenly, absurdly conscious of the blood on her scrubs, the sweat on her face, and something shifted in his expression, some private recognition clicking into place that Lola didn't have the context to understand. "You're her," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know what that means," Lola said, "and right now, I don't have time to find out. Get your men out of my doorway or hold it for me, one or the other, but either way, I need this room." The man held her gaze one more second. Then he stepped back, raised a hand, and his people fell into position around the ruined threshold, weapons up, faces grim, holding the line the way soldiers hold a line for a commander they've decided, without needing to be told, is worth dying for. Lola turned back to the table, to Daejin Kim's pale, breathing, barely stable face, and finished the job. He woke 4 days later, in a private room with the blinds drawn and a security detail Lola had stopped asking questions about, because every question she'd tried to ask about who was paying for the armed men rotating through the hallway outside had been met with a polite, immovable silence from hospital administration that told her, more clearly than an answer would have, exactly how far above her pay grade the truth sat. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the low light, and found her sitting in the chair beside the bed, where she had spent more off-shift hours than she would have admitted to anyone, ostensibly monitoring his post-operative recovery, actually simply unable to make herself leave. "You're the surgeon," he said. His voice was a rasp, wrecked from the ventilator, but steady. "I am. They told me a name." He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel, briefly, 9 years old again, and dying, and looked at by this exact same man across a distance of 10 years and an alley she barely remembered, except through her mother's voice. "Lola." Something in her chest went very still. "Yes. There was a girl," Daejin said slowly, each word costing him something. "In an alley, a long time ago. Sick, dying, I thought. Her mother said her name was Lola. That was me," Lola said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice had gone thick. "You paid for my surgery, you saved my life, and then you disappeared, and I spent 10 years wondering if I'd ever get the chance to tell you that it worked, that I lived, that I became exactly the kind of doctor who could someday save someone else's life the way you saved mine." Daejin closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet, and for a moment the terrifying, legendary architecture of Daejin Kim fell away entirely, revealing only a tired old man who had once, a very long time ago, done one good thing without understanding why, and had spent a decade wondering, in the quietest, most buried part of himself, whether it had mattered. "You saved my life twice then," he said, "once by living, once by not letting me die for it." Lola reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had gripped her wrist in the trauma bay, seeking her without recognizing her, some animal instinct in him finding its way toward the one person in that chaotic room who had, without either of them knowing it yet, already decided to save him. "I got you," she said, and meant it in every sense the words could hold. The story that reached the underworld in the weeks that followed was simple and terrible and, everyone who mattered agreed, entirely plausible. Daejin Kim, betrayed by his own son, gravely wounded in the coup, had succumbed to his injuries in a private hospital room, quietly, without fanfare, the way old lions are sometimes allowed to die once the pride has already decided to move on without them. Jae-won, having failed to secure a clean kill and having lost 4 men and any hope of hiding his role in the attempt, found himself, within a month, dealing with a syndicate that had smelled weakness on both sides and moved, with the specific and merciless efficiency such organizations reserve for moments of vulnerability, to carve up what remained of an empire nobody had the stomach left to defend. None of it was Daejin's problem anymore. He had, in the practical, legal, financial sense that mattered to the people who might come looking, ceased to exist. A death certificate quietly filed, a body no one but 3 trusted loyalists had ever actually seen, an empire he had already, in the preceding years, been slowly, invisibly divesting from in favor of shell companies and shadow investments that had nothing to do with the criminal architecture Jaewon had inherited, and was now, brick by brick, losing. What remained of Daejin Kim lived, these days, in a modest apartment 4 blocks from Seoul Metro Hospital, under a name that belonged to no ledger, no rumor, no old debt. He took walks in the mornings. He read, mostly, and found, to his quiet astonishment, that he had opinions about novels now, having never previously had the leisure to develop any. And most evenings, if the weather allowed it, he sat on a bench across the street from the hospital's main entrance, an old man with gray hair and a folded newspaper, watching the comings and goings of a building he had quietly owned for a decade without ever once letting its most important resident know it. He watched Lola leave most nights around 8, sometimes later, her white coat traded for a jacket, her stethoscope still looped absently around her neck the way surgeons sometimes forget to remove it, carrying herself with the particular exhausted pride of someone who has spent the day doing exactly the work she was always meant to do. He never approached her. He had learned, a long time ago, the specific mercy of leaving well enough alone, and he understood now, more clearly than he'd ever understood anything in 30 years of empire, that the greatest thing he had ever built in his life was not the syndicate, not the money, not the fear his name had once commanded in every corner of the city. It was her. The doctor on the bench across the street would never see. The daughter he'd never claimed, saved by a debt he'd never expected repaid, now spending her own life exactly the way his one good act had made possible. Saving strangers, one gurney at a time, in a hospital that had turned out, all along, to be the one true legacy of a man the world believed was dead. Some nights, watching her walk to her car under the hospital's floodlights, safe, alive, entirely unaware of the silent protector on the bench across the street, Daejin Kim allowed himself, for the first time in his life, something that felt remarkably, uncomplicatedly, like peace.